Understanding the Brain, a Key to Spiritual Growth. Welcome to this episode. Here I will talk a bit about the brain. Of course, there is a lot to be said about the brain, and if you really want to understand its functions, you should also seek information from other sources. In this concise overview, I will first describe the main components of our nervous system. You can skip this part if you know the brain's basic functions. At 7:40, I will talk about mirror neurons, and finally, at 11:25, I will highlight a few crucial functions that everyone working on their spirituality should know about, as they are crucial to how we perceive ourselves and our surroundings. Our nervous system consists of neurons, which send and receive electrical and chemical signals from other neurons and glial cells, which, among other functions, support and hold together the nerve tissue and service the neurons by ensuring they get oxygen and nutrients from the blood and have their waste products removed back into the bloodstream. Our brain has about 86 billion neurons and roughly 10 times as many glial cells. At one end of a neuron, there is a cell body that processes the information received by the cell body's dendrites from other neurons. From the cell body, an axon also extends. It is a nerve fiber that can be up to a meter long, and it branches out at the other end with terminal boutons that transmit signals to other neurons. Since each neuron, on average, receives and sends signals from more than 1,000 other neurons, the human brain is by far the most complex network we know of. There are several different types of neurons. For example, a sensory neuron can generate an electrical pulse through pressure or chemical stimulation, and a motor neuron can send a signal that causes muscle fibers to contract or sweat glands to sweat. All the signals to and from the nerves in the body converge in the spinal cord, which can also independently perform the simplest reflexes. For instance, if a doctor taps just below a patient's kneecap with a small hammer, the tap is detected by some sensory neurons connected via interneurons in the spinal cord to some motor neurons that cause the thigh muscles to contract, making the lower leg jerk. This type of nerve activity is called the monosynaptic reflex arc. It happens automatically and is an example of the simplest form of nerve activity in the body. The earliest developed animals only had this form of nerve activity. For example, E. coli bacteria, which have lived on Earth for billions of years, have some sensory receptors on their surface that can detect the concentration of nutrients in their surroundings. They move forward using their appendages in a simple pattern. As long as the concentration of nutrients is high or increasing, they move steadily forward in a straight line. However, if the concentration of nutrients is decreasing, the movements of their appendages become more random, causing them to change direction frequently to find new areas with a high concentration of nutrients. It is purely reflex, and this type of nerve activity is still a very important part of humans today. The brainstem connects the spinal cord to the midbrain. In the brainstem, all functions are still fast and automatic. Brain activity in the spinal cord and brainstem can be compared to the type found in insects, where even complex functions are primarily controlled by reflexes. For example, a cockroach can react quickly if attacked because it has sensory hairs directly connected to its legs, allowing it to flee rapidly if the sensory hairs detect pressure variations in the air. In the brainstem, we find some of the brain's centers for very simple reflexes, such as regulating breathing, body temperature, and wakefulness. Unlike insects, however, humans also have the cerebellum, which hangs from the brainstem at the back of the head, just below the cerebrum. When the cerebrum decides to perform a movement, the cerebellum coordinates how the nerve pathways should be activated. This coordination is crucial for smooth and precise movements, such as tying a shoelace or playing the piano. The cerebellum, therefore, contains our knowledge of how different movements should be performed, coordinated, and combined. Humans, and all other vertebrates, have a central nervous system that can be divided into four main modules: the spinal cord, the brainstem, the midbrain, and the cerebrum. The simplest brain functions are located at the bottom and back of the brain, and as we move up and forward in the brain, it can perform more complex tasks. Right above the brainstem is the midbrain, which includes the thalamus, a sort of relay station that distributes various sensory inputs to the respective centers in the brain, and the hypothalamus, which controls our temperature, hormones, metabolism, thirst, hunger, sexual behavior, fear, anger, and our various activity rhythms. Close to the thalamus, in the middle of the brain, we have the temporal lobes, the innermost part of the cerebrum, with centers for hearing, language comprehension, the sense of smell, memory, and the limbic system. The limbic system includes the hippocampus, which organizes our long-term memory, and the amygdala, which is crucial for processing our emotions. At the beginning of life, all our sensory impressions are processed unconsciously in the temporal lobe through some pre-programmed automatic reactions to what we sense. However, shortly after birth, we start forming nerve connections from the middle of the brain to the surface of the cerebrum, where we later develop our consciousness and thoughts. The entire cerebrum is divided into two halves, connected by the corpus callosum. Motorically, the left part of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right part controls the left. The two parts are specialized. For example, most people predominantly handle language functions by the left side of the brain. At the back of the cerebrum, above the cerebellum, we have the occipital lobe, which contains the visual cortex. Unlike prey animals with their eyes on the sides of their heads, humans are predators. Our eyes face forward, allowing us, like other predators, to focus on our prey. However, inside the brain, we process our visual impressions at the back of the head. The parietal lobes are above the occipital lobes and towards the top of the head. They process various sensory inputs such as pain, touch, pressure, and temperature. This is also where we form our spatial awareness. The frontal lobes, also known as the prefrontal cortex, are at the top of the head and towards the forehead. They are much more developed in humans than in other animals. This area is where we assess our sensory impressions to respond appropriately to environmental stimuli. It is also where we plan our lives and make decisions, and where we form the basis for our behavior and personality. When the discovery of mirror neurons in rhesus monkeys was described in 1996, it significantly impacted our understanding of the human learning process. Mirror neurons are brain cells active when we perform or notice another primate performing a movement. The same brain cells are activated in both cases. This allows us to observe and recognize movements in other people, and thereby become capable of performing similar movements ourselves. We copy or mirror our fellow humans. Mirror neurons are specialized, and individual neurons react only to a small specific part of a movement. However, together they can identify complex movements, even if we only observe a part of the movement. This enables us to understand the intention behind a movement we observe, even if the movement is not completed. For example, if we see just the hint of a hand clenched aggressively, we can imagine the fully clenched and threatening hand. We will also be ready to clench our hands as the brain cells that can command this movement have already been activated. In the temporal lobes in the middle of the brain, we have two brain centers that contain mirror neurons. One area forms the basis for our subjective feelings and is important for distinguishing between ourselves and others. The other can process impulses from several of the body's sensors and is closely connected to the parts of the brain that enable us to recognize objects and faces and to process sound. Mirror neurons can, therefore, link sounds with likely action sequences, allowing us to imitate these sounds. They are also crucial for our ability to learn language, as mirror neurons in the brain areas motorically control the throat and mouth. A baby, just a few days old, is capable of imitating the facial expressions of the adults around it. This ability is also important for adults, as recognizing the unconscious micro-expressions in other people allows them to empathize with those people's situations and feelings. The emotions we unconsciously display through our body language affect the people who observe us. Without mirror neurons, we wouldn't be able to develop empathy. One side effect of Botox treatments can, therefore, be a reduced ability to understand other people's emotions. Mirror neurons need feedback from our own facial muscles to read and understand another person's facial expression. We can actively use our knowledge of mirror neurons to influence others. For example, if we choose to smile while talking to someone, that person will unconsciously smile inwardly, making them more receptive to what we say. Stress and anxiety reduce the signaling rate of mirror neurons, making it easier to understand others when we can calmly give them our full attention rather than when we are afraid. One of the abilities that distinguish slightly older children from very young children and apes is the ability to suppress the imitation of observed movements. From the age of 3, the higher cognitive functions in the frontal lobes of the brain have developed enough for children to suppress the action reflex of mirror neurons. They still perceive the movements of their surroundings and can understand their significance, but they can consciously decide whether to perform the movements or to do something else. Mirror neurons are also located at the back of the frontal lobes, and the frontal lobes have the highest concentration of brain cells that chemically detect the brain's reward substance, dopamine, which is crucial for our learning process. This fantastic system gives the most developed animal species self-awareness and enables humans to make complex decisions. However, like everything else in nature, these superior abilities come at a price. It takes time to develop the brain, so humans have a long gestation period, and our children cannot fend for themselves when they are born. Our brains allow us to be conscious of only one situation at a time. Most researchers believe that an average person can consciously perceive only 3 to 7 different situations per second, even though we sense much more. Processing in very complex neural connections takes time. Therefore, the brain has a system in the amygdala that marks sensory impressions important to us with an attention impulse, while what we have become accustomed to is not marked and thus remains unprocessed. For example, after tying our shoes, we don't notice the pressure that the sensory neurons register in the foot, and these sensory impressions leave only faint traces in the brain, which are quickly cleaned out when we sleep. However, if the shoelace comes undone, we will likely notice a change in pressure on the foot. The amygdala can also detect and draw the cerebrum's attention to sensory impressions that resemble ones that previously caused fear or posed a threat to our survival. Simultaneously, the amygdala makes us aware of these past memories and moods so we can begin to defend ourselves in thought and perhaps also in action. Recent research has shown that the amygdala also detects positive stimuli from our senses. Thus, we notice if sensory impressions contain both strong negative and positive emotional components. There is also evidence that the amygdala can detect sensory impressions important for our social interactions, although researchers have not yet fully understood these advanced functions. Our current chemical and hormonal status also affects our attention to what we sense. For example, if we are in love, we experience our world more positively, just as we become more irritated by small things if we have hormonal or chemical imbalances in the body. With our thoughts in the frontal lobes, we can decide at any time to notice specific sensory impressions. For example, we can choose to feel the constant pressure on the foot from our shoes, and a mother who normally sleeps well in noisy environments can wake up if her child makes faint sounds. Our brain notices more of what we want it to notice, and often also what we think about, as the temporal lobes consider it important. For example, suppose we convince ourselves that people with green eyes behave in a certain way. In that case, we can pass by many people with green eyes and different behaviors without noticing them, while immediately noticing those who confirm our assumption. This is why propaganda works particularly well on people with many problems and painful memories. They only have a conscious brain capacity to notice what is most necessary, as their consciousness is filled with long chains of thoughts where they are defending themselves. They often lack the capacity to notice what could disprove their prejudices. However, we can all overlook even very obvious and serious events happening right before us if our brains are too busy with something else. Suppose we sense something that earlier in life was followed by unpleasant experiences. Our brain will immediately go into defense mode, and we will start defending ourselves in our thoughts while becoming aware of the emotional states we previously experienced. Therefore, some of our thoughts are triggered by memories of past experiences that are reactivated by the present situation. We judge and experience the present based on past experiences. These thoughts keep us stuck in past behavioral patterns, thus preventing us from perceiving our surroundings and possibilities as they truly are. What we experience in early childhood lies deep in our memory, with new memories stored on top of the old ones. At some point, these early memories are forgotten and thus become unconscious, making them difficult to process, but they still influence our perception of the present. For instance, if we were exposed to loud shouting during early childhood while experiencing something very unpleasant, the sound of loud voices will likely affect us for the rest of our lives, even if we have long forgotten those childhood experiences. Since we can only be conscious of a small portion of what we sense, most of us make many of our decisions on a subconscious level. These precursors to conscious thoughts don't always consider our self-awareness. Thus, they are not always placed in a context where there is a clear distinction between ourselves and our surroundings. Nonetheless, they influence our mental filters and our self-understanding. If our subconscious thoughts are aggressive, the result can be that we become aggressive and judgmental toward ourselves. The brain adapts throughout life to the needs of the individual. When we learn something new, the electrical connections between the involved brain neurons are strengthened by repeating what we have learned. This happens, among other ways, through the building up of insulating myelin sheaths around the axons of individual neurons. Myelin is an insulating fatty substance that colors the brain white and insulates the electrical connections, making them up to 100 times stronger and thereby more dominant. The brain becomes better at what it frequently does and loses the ability to do what it does not. Our memory can be divided into short-term and long-term memory, and long-term memory can be divided into semantic memory, which recalls isolated facts, and episodic memory, where many individual parts are combined into a coherent memory of events we have experienced. Our episodic memories of the past, however, are not factually accurate. Instead, we adapt our memories of the past to meet the needs we anticipate for the future. Typically, memories consist of some factual elements, while others have been added or changed later to align with our current prejudices, expectations, and attitudes. When we recall our memories, we cannot distinguish between factual events and what we have later fabricated. Nevertheless, we analyze these memories to derive a general lesson from them, which we then use moving forward in our lives. In this way, the brain thinks its results are always correct when analyzing various situations in the world, although this is seldom the case. The fact that memory is not factually accurate can actually be an advantage, because it allows us to change our undesirable ideas in long-term memory by reactivating and disinforming them. We can consciously influence our memory so that our abilities and personality improve. This requires reactivating the undesirable schemas in the brain by feeling and acknowledging the resulting situations, and then updating our long-term memory with new and more positive experiences. We can reprogram our personal history by thinking of the various people in our past with love, joy, and acceptance. From this perspective, it is never too late to have a happy childhood, which is important because the awareness of a happy childhood helps us achieve more self-esteem and freedom in the present. If you compare all this with the previous episode, it will be clear why early childhood is so important. What we learned early in life still affects our view of ourselves and the world, unless we actively change what we contain, even if it may no longer be in accordance with our present situation. The more conflicts and unconscious repressions we have, the more sensory impressions will trigger chains of automatic thoughts that keep us stuck in the past, preventing us from using our conscious capacity to choose more appropriate solutions in the present. Our early past can also affect our current abilities. A classic example is a child who grows up in an environment with many arguments, where it is important for the adults to be right. The child does not want to participate, as there are always winners and losers, and the child's solution to that problem is to say, "I don't know." This allows the child to avoid participating. But if this statement sticks, the child will find that there is a lot they don't know as adults. When humans fully developed about 100,000 years ago, our brains were initially designed to enhance survival. Since then, humanity has demonstrated its evolutionary superiority. Today, however, some of the brain's functions can keep us trapped in our past if the brain alone is left unchecked to control our lives. As mentioned, it is possible to reprogram oneself, but it requires a focused effort. First, we must become aware of what we truly contain. Then, we must let go of our painful emotions and unhelpful ideas and replace them with more loving and constructive thoughts and ideas. In this course, I will present some effective techniques that have worked for me, but you must choose to do the necessary work yourself. Thank you so much for tuning in. In the next episode, I'll discuss how the words we use significantly impact how we perceive our world and how small changes in our language can be essential for leading a better life.